Jason Fung, nephrologist and best-selling author, shares his experiences utilizing an individualized approach to fasting to successfully treat thousands of overweight, metabolically ill, and diabetic patients, and why being a doctor who specializes in kidney disease gives him a unique insight into early indications of metabolic disease. Let's listen to Dr. Jason Fung.
So today I'm going to talk about salt, actually. So this is the article we're discussing, which actually just came out in May of this year. So it's in the BMJ and is a Cochrane review. And a Cochrane review is basically where they take a lot of studies and they look through all the studies and trying to make some sense of it, because many of these studies are very, very small. So they do a meta-analysis, which is basically they take all the published data and they try and put it all together and try and make some sense of what's going on. And for this particular topic, they look at salt reduction on blood pressure. So this is the results of what they found. And if you look, they list all the trials on the side, on this side, and they show the benefit in terms of change in systolic blood pressure with salt reduction. So you see that there's many, many different trials ranging from 1973 all the way up to 2009. And when they kind of put them all together, what they find is that you have about a 5.4 millimeter of mercury decrease in your blood pressure when you restrict salt. If you look at hypertensive people, that's the benefit. If you look at people with normal blood pressures, they don't show quite as much benefit, but nevertheless, they still show a highly significant benefit in terms of reduction of blood pressure. So the reduction in blood pressure is 2.4. So the other one is, their blood pressures are higher and you get a bigger benefit. So not much of a surprise there. The other thing they looked at was the effect on hormones, because salt reduction has many effects, one of which is reduction in blood pressure. So they looked at several hormones, the plasma renin, the aldosterone, the noradrenaline, and the adrenaline. And what they found is that there's actually increases in these hormones. So if you look at plasma renin, for instance, the change is 0.26. For aldosterone, it's 73.2. Noradrenaline and adrenaline is the same thing. But you can see that the p-values on this side are less than 0.001, which indicates that there's actually a very highly significant increase in those hormones, statistically significant. The magnitude of which you have to decide for yourself whether these are clinically significant or not. So that's the trials. They looked at all the trials and they made certain conclusions. So they put all these trials together. There are 34 in total. And what they said was that a modest reduction in salt intake for 4 or more weeks causes a significant, and from a population viewpoint, important fall in blood pressure in both hypertensive and normotensive individuals. So that's basically what they're saying, is that it's not a huge decrease. If you look at it, for normotensive people, it's about 2.5. If you look at hypertensives, it's a little over 5. But if you look over many, many, many people, that's actually a very important reduction. Salt reduction is also associated with a small physiologic increase in the plasma renin, aldosterone, and noradrenaline. So basically, these were the conclusions. You should eat less salt. So if you have less salt, you have lower blood pressure, and that's good. The price you pay for that is a slightly higher, but still physiologic increase in your renin, aldosterone, and noradrenaline. So the one thing you have to be a little bit careful about is something called confirmation bias, which is a bias that exists in all of us, which is that you have a certain view of the world. And you tend to view all new information kind of through that filter. So it's kind of like looking through the world with rose-colored glasses. So we believe that salt causes hypertension and salt is really bad for you. So this actually confirms what we are saying. What you have to be careful about is that you have to be careful that perhaps you may have a little bit too much confirmation bias in this. So one of the ways that you can look for publication bias in a meta-analysis, which is actually very important, is something called a funnel plot. You have to understand what a funnel plot is. So a funnel plot is where you take all the studies and you plot them according to size. So this is what it should look like. So if you look at this, for instance, suppose you have a trial, for instance, where you flip a coin. So if you flip one coin, it might be 100% heads or 100% tails. If you flip two coins, it might be 50% or 100%, but nevertheless, you have a very wide splay. As your trials get larger and larger, it tends to approach what is the actual value. So a funnel plot takes all the points of data and arranges them according to the number of cycles or the number of flips of your coin or the number of trials or the number of patients in your trial. And what you see is that the smaller trials tend to have a very wide variation, but they should be the equal number above and below. Okay? And as you get bigger and bigger, you get a more accurate view of what your real value should be, and you see less up and down, but you should see equal numbers above and below. So if you look at the meta-analysis done in hypertension in 1997, what you see is this. If you look at the sample size, as the sample size gets bigger and bigger, you see that it approaches this value just below 0. Okay? But look where all of the trials are. All of the trials sit below that line, which means there's evidence of severe publication bias because basically all the trials that show you benefit are published, but all the trials that don't show any benefit are not published. So you can think of it this way. If you publish all your trials where you flip a coin and you get lots of tails, and you don't publish all the ones that come up heads, then you think that the coin will flip tails every single time if you look at all the data in the available. So you always have to do a funnel plot analysis because otherwise you don't know if you're looking through the world through these rose-colored glasses, if you're just taking confirmation bias, because there's bias in everybody. So in 1997 you can see that there's actually a fairly significant bias existing already. So you can look at the funnel plot here. So they've done the same thing. They've kind of flipped the axis a little bit. But you can see that as the numbers of people in your trial go up and up, you get a better sense of what the true value should be. And that sits somewhere along here. But all your trials are down here, which means, again, same as the previous meta-analysis that was done, you actually have a lot of confirmation bias, you have a lot of publication bias. That is, all the trials that show you benefit in terms of reduction in blood pressure get published, and all the ones that don't show you any benefit don't get published. So in this paper, actually, the p-value was 0.025, which means that there actually exists substantial evidence for publication bias. And what they said in this paper is that, well, if you take away the two biggest trials, then it no longer exists. Well, which is really funny because it's the larger trials which determines what is your estimate of the true value. So they say, well, let's just take these out, then it looks good. Well, that's where you're getting your mean from, right? So you can't really do that, but they did it anyway because I don't know why they did it. It's stupid. So what you can see in this paper is that you actually have to be very careful because there actually is a very substantial bias towards publishing papers that show you benefit. The other thing that's important is to look in context of where you are. And one of the things that's always interesting is looking at causation versus association studies. Because if you have a hypothesis that one thing causes the other, then those two things will be correlated. But you can't go backward. So if, for instance, you think smoking causes lung cancer, then you expect that you will find increasing smoking and increasing lung cancer together. But you can't say that if you see smoking and lung cancer associated, it doesn't mean that they're causal. So you can't prove that causation, but you can disprove that causation. That is, if all of a sudden you see that as there's more and more smokers, you have less and less cancer, then you would say then it's probably not true that smoking causes lung cancer, because that doesn't make sense. If smoking causes lung cancer, you should see that association. If that association doesn't hold, then it's not likely to be true. So you can disprove the causation theory, but you can't ever prove it. Okay? So let's take this for salt. So we think salt causes cardiovascular events. So therefore, we expect that if you have higher salt intake, you have higher cardiovascular events. So you you can disprove the causation if you see that as you take more and more salt, you have less and less events. Then it's not likely that the salt is causing your cardiovascular events. So let's put this in context, because this is the thing you always have to do when you look at a journal article. So even back in 1972, there was a bit of concern about the low-salt diet. And the concern was this. You can lower blood pressure, okay? Nobody's disputing that you can lower blood pressure, but there's a price to pay. And the price is that you're going to raise your renin and aldosterone levels. And in fact, you raise them fairly substantially. So you raise your renin 3.6% and your aldosterone 3.2%. So while you may lower your blood pressure, you may actually put yourself at higher risk of coronary artery disease. So that's the concern, even back in 1972. So where did we get this whole idea that salt is really, really bad for you? Well, it came mostly out of the InterSalt study. So the InterSalt study was done in 1988, where they measured salt intakes over 52 different groups in 32 different countries. And they basically plotted them all on a graph, and they said, this is your salt intake, and this is blood pressure. And they did the same thing for cardiovascular events, and it's very similar, so I only showed one of the graphs. What you can see is that there's 4 outliers, okay? And those outliers were very primitive societies. They were the Yanomamo and Xingu Indians of Brazil, the rural population in Kenya, and Papua New Guinea, right? Everybody else, all those other 48 groups, you can see clusters fairly tightly, somewhere between 100 and 200 millimoles of sodium. And they basically compared them all together. But the problem is that these 4 groups are really clearly different from one another. And they're not just different in terms of salt. They're different in terms of many, many things. They're probably different in terms of the sugar intake, the processed foods, exercise, pollution, hygiene, customs, probably very, very, very different. Is it really fair to put them in the same group? Because it's like, here you have an average, say somewhere around 150 millimoles of sodium, and here it's like 2, right? So you have one group which is eating 75 times as much sodium. But not only that, but they're completely different in almost every way you can think about. So it's kind of like, say you have a bunch of geniuses with an IQ of 150, okay? And then you put 4 people in the group, 4 chimpanzees who have an IQ of 2. And then you say, well, this group really eats a lot of bananas, so, the more bananas you eat, the stupider you are. Well, that's not really fair, because you've taken 4 chimpanzees who are clearly not part of that group, and you've put them in the same comparison. And the thing is that it's all driven through these 4 groups. These are these groups of completely primitive societies, because if you take all 52 groups of people, what you find is that as you get higher and higher sodium, your blood pressure and cardiovascular events go up. But say you exclude those 4 groups of people and say, well, we really shouldn't compare the chimpanzees in this group of geniuses, or we shouldn't compare 0 millimoles with the 150, because everyone else in the world is eating about this much. Well, you find that the correlation actually goes in the other direction. That is, this is the regression line if you take out those 4 groups of people. So as you eat more and more sodium, your blood pressure and your cardiovascular events doesn't go up. It actually slopes slightly downwards. Okay? So this is the problem with the InterSalt study, and this is where we base most of our idea that salt is really, really bad for you. But even if you look at the InterSalt study and life expectancy, you can see that the life expectancy doesn't go down as you eat more salt. It actually, as you eat more salt, the life expectancy goes up. And that's not to say that salt is really good for you. These people are probably dying of like malaria and TB and stuff, right? It's a completely different set of people. It's not really valid, but nevertheless, you really don't see that there's any correlation between salt and life expectancy. And what's really interesting is that if you take these Kuna Indians, and Dr. Hollenberg from Harvard did this a few years ago, he took people in this primitive group of people, And he followed them, and some of them migrated to Panama City, so turned from a very primitive society to a regular sort of society. And what happened is that the original Indians, as they got older, their blood pressure didn't go up. But as they migrated, they actually did the same thing as most people in the civilized world, which is that as you get older, your blood pressure goes up. But what the real interesting thing was, he looked at what happened to those Kuna Islanders who started trading for salt. That is, all the environmental and dietary factors were the same, except they started trading for salt. And what he found was that there was no hypertension. So even when you add salt to this group, you don't get hypertension and you don't get cardiovascular events. So there is something dietary-wise or environmental-wise that is driving this, but it's probably not the salt. Okay, so it's hard to say that it is the salt from that standpoint. So let's take the intersalt study aside, and let's look at the rest of the world, for instance. So we can look at salt consumptions through the rest of the world, and we can compare them. So you see that Canada and the United States sit somewhere around here. And you can see well off the charts is Japan and Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Scandinavia, right? And that's because the Japanese eat a lot of soy sauce, and the Scandinavians, they eat a lot of like salted fish and pickled fish. And you might think, wow, they're taking lots of salt. They must be like dying in droves, right? Well, of course you know the answer to that. This is the mortality, cardiovascular mortality. Here's the USA, and here's Norway, and here's Japan. So they're not dying at all. In fact, they're outliving you like 4-to-1. And they're eating way more salt than you. Now, there's a lot of differences between Japanese and the United States, but at the same time, you got to say if that salt is really a super important part of the equation, because the association runs in the wrong way. That is, it'd be hard to say that salt causes cardiovascular mortality based on this. But there's so many differences between countries, it's more important. Let's see if we can get some data within the same country. And luckily for us, there is. The NHANES 1 data was, so the NHANES was a United States data, and they basically take a huge population-based survey of the United States, looked at all different kinds of things, and one of the things they looked at here, and it published in The Lancet in 1998, was salt. So here they break them into quartiles. So this is what they normally do, is they take people and they divide them on how much salt they take. So number 1 means that you take the least salt, and number 4 means you take the most salt. Okay? And they did the same thing for calories. And what you see is that as you take more and more salt, your mortality goes down and down. That is, if you eat less salt, you are more likely to die. Okay? That's, again, contrary to what we would believe for the most part. And that holds for total mortality and cardiovascular mortality. You can look at the NHANES 2 data, which is a little bit more recent, published in 2006, and you can look at the same thing. So this is 13.7-year follow-up. And this is cardiovascular, and this is all-cause mortality. They break it down into, if you take sodium greater than 2,300 milligrams, which is the daily recommended amount. So if you take a high-salt diet versus a low-salt diet. And what you can see is that for both mortality and cardiovascular mortality, as you take a high-salt diet, your mortality goes down. Not up, it goes down. It's not even equal, right? These are highly significant numbers. And what they said was that the inverse association of sodium to CVD mortality raises question about the likelihood of survival advantage accompanying a lower sodium diet. That is, if you think eating low salt is good for you, this is not really helping your case here. And you can go to the NHANES 3 data. So again, published more recently, 2008. And here again, you have follow-up of 8,700 U.S. adults. And they're looking at mortality. So here's the quartile. So here's the low-salt people, and here's the high-salt people. As you take more and more salt, you see cardiovascular disease goes down. Mortality either stays same or goes down. So as you're eating more and more salt, your risk of dying and your risk of heart attack is going down. And this is all, remember, within the same country, right? So now you don't have those differences between the Japanese with all their fish intake versus the United States, you know, eating a lot of beef and processed foods, right? This is all within the same country. So it's clear that lowering the salt can reduce the blood pressure, right? And that was shown in the DASH diet. The DASH diet did all kinds of things, but one of the things was to lower salt. But it's clear that if you reduce salt, you reduce blood pressure. But that's not really what we're interested in. What we're interested in is, can you lower cardiac events, right? Because that's what is really harmful. So you can look, and even going back almost 10 years, in 1995, what they did was they took almost 3,000 hypertensive men, so people with high blood pressure. Okay, these are the people we tell, you should eat less salt, right? So they take in and they follow them for 3.8 years, and they actually measured urinary sodium. So they measured 24-hour urines, checked how much sodium, and decided how much sodium are you eating. And they broke them down according to how much they're eating. And you can see that as urinary sodium excretion goes down, so because what you take in is generally excreted, and if you're in steady state, that means these people are in the high salt diet, and these people are in the low salt diet. So what happens? This is the event rate, cardiovascular event rate, for people as they take more and more salt, their event rate goes down and down. Okay? And this is completely contrary to the advice that we've been giving people, right? Because we've been telling people with high blood pressure, hey, you should eat less salt. But why would you want to do that? That doesn't even make sense. You want to be in this group with all the heart attacks, or do you want to be in this group without all the heart attacks? So you can look at the what happens to their hormones, because it always keeps coming back to this. This reduction in blood pressure is not like free. It's like there's a cost to it. So even back then, when you look at these data, the renin, you can see that there's a highly statistically significant increase in the renin, aldosterone, and adrenaline. Okay? And that's the cost of your hypertension. If you look at the, there's a little bit of data looking at cholesterol, and there's some people who think that if you take a low-salt diet, your cholesterol may actually go up. Triglycerides may actually go up. And this was published in the American Journal of Hypertension. That wasn't confirmed in our current study, but nevertheless, it's a concern for some people because, again, maybe that's part of the cost of reducing your salt intake. And you can look at randomized control trials like the TOHP, and these are randomized trials. So this is really the gold standard where you take one group and you split them into high salt and low salt diet. And so they did a number 1 and number 2, but you can see number 2 is a much bigger study. It's almost 2,000 people. You can see this is the event rate for low salt versus high salt. So 78.8 versus 78.5. So really no difference. So even after 10 to 15 years of salt restriction, you really can't show any kind of benefit to this low-salt diet. The odds ratio, is 0.93, which is pretty close to, 1.0, which is no effect. So it's really hard to say that there is any kind of benefit. But nevertheless, there continues to be evidence, or continues to be association studies showing the opposite. That is, if you take this study, for instance, which was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association 2 years ago, they took people and they followed them for 7.9 years, and they looked at urinary sodium excretion. This is the follow-up period, and this is cardiovascular mortality, right? So this is the endpoint per 100 participants. So clearly there's 3 different groups. So this group is the low-salt group, and this group is the high-salt group. So this is the 24-hour urinary excretion. So as you take more and more salt, you can see that you actually have better and better protection. Okay? As you take the low salt, you have a huge increase. So from 1 point something to 4 point something, so a 2-3 times increase in your cardiac event rate when you take a low salt diet. It looks pretty bad. And here again is the same thing. If you look at aldosterone levels, renin, and angiotensin II, you can see that the price you pay for a low-salt diet is higher aldosterone, renin, and angiotensin II. There may be some concern about insulin resistance as well, so the low-salt diet, it's possible that you may have more insulin resistance, but that was only published in one study, and I wasn't able to find it anywhere else. And this is another Cochrane review, which was very interesting because they broke the trials down into several different groups. So one of the groups, so this is favored salt reduction, and you can see for hypertension, most of the studies fall right on 0. So it's really hard to show that there's really any benefit. But there was one group that it looked like it was actually very harmful to follow a low-salt diet. And that group was the cardiac patients. So the people with heart failure, the ones that you all tell to eat a low-salt diet, they seem to do much worse than everybody else. In fact, it's actually got to the point where this was just recently published in 2013, May of 2013, which was the Institute of Medicine. So because of all the controversy, the National Academy of Science in the United States gathered a bunch of people together, and they said, well, let's look at all the studies, but forget hypertension. Let's focus on health outcomes, right? Real outcomes like heart attacks and stroke, and not surrogate outcomes like blood pressure. Because yeah, you can lower blood pressure, nobody's denying that. But what I want to know is, are you going to have a heart attack, right? And what they found was that the evidence on health outcomes is not consistent with efforts that encourage lowering of dietary sodium in the general population. That is, when you look at studies that look at heart attacks and strokes and real events, there's no evidence that a low-salt diet does anything good for you. Furthermore, they said that the low sodium intake may lead to risk of adverse health effects amongst those with mid to late stage heart failure, which was the study that I showed you previously. That is, okay, for most people it doesn't seem to do any good for you, but especially for those people with heart failure, you want to be very, very careful because the low-salt diet might be extremely harmful to you. Okay? It's not only not good for you, but it might be actually very harmful to you. And everything else was that there wasn't really enough evidence to conclude.